Good afternoon. Just apologies, I'm going to take a flight back a little earlier tonight, so for a function I have in Auckland, so I don't have a huge amount of time, but I've kept my remarks reasonably brief, so we can probably talk about it quite quickly. But this weekend I'm looking forward to hosting Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard in Queenstown for the annual Australian-New Zealand Prime Minister's Talks. This year's talks are particularly significant in that they mark 30 years since the conclusion of CER, one of the most comprehensive and successful trade agreements in the world. CER has helped make Australia and New Zealand two of the most integrated and successful economies anywhere. I also look forward to, most integrated economies. I also look forward to discussing the recommendations of our Joint Productivity Commission's report into strengthening economic relations between Australia and New Zealand. We also expect to discuss cooperation in the Asia Pacific region and other parts of the world, particularly as Australia looks towards assuming a presidency of the G20 and a seat on the UN Security Council. Australia and New Zealand's engagement on defence and security matters, including cooperation in cybersecurity, will also be on the agenda. I will be meeting Prime Minister Gillard when she arrives in Queenstown at 4:30 on Friday afternoon. So in terms of my ministerial activity this week, tomorrow and Wednesday I'll be in Waitangi for various events and advisory will come from my office soon on that. On Thursday we have our one-day caucus at Premier House. Friday and Saturday I'll be in Queenstown with Julia Gillard, which means unfortunately I won't be able to attend Sir Paul Holmes' funeral on Friday in Auckland. I can't make the flights. So that's really good for me.
Prime Minister, what's your understanding of who will be escorting you on to the right tomorrow?
Look, I don't have any details of that. That'll be ultimately a matter for the elders at Titi Marae, but in all probability it'll be Tita Whaihara, I would expect, because I think she escorted the Governor-General on today, but it's a matter for them.
Are you anticipating the Prince would be repeated there?
That's the pattern of the past. You can't rule it out. We hope that's not the case, but you know, history tells you there's usually a high degree of conflict or anxiety there, and certainly quite a number of protesters, so we'll see how it goes.
Mark Hall has been saying that you're treating Māori cruelly and brutally. What's your response to that?
I can't see why he'd make those comments. I mean, this is a government that has completed a huge number of settlements in the time that we've been in office. I think there's been something like 56 settlements completed, 33 of them in the last 4 years under a National League government. We've been working very hard in the areas where we see underachievement occurring and where it's having a big impact on Māori, particularly around education. If you go and think about Whanau, a good example of a program which we think will at least help at-risk Māori families. So I don't think there's any basis for that argument.
The Māori Council have also indicated that they'll be confronting you tomorrow. Have you prepared in any way for that?
Well, they're free to go and do that, of course. I mean, we'll have a number of meetings there with Iwi leaders and the likes. It's always a pretty full program, but you know, I understand the Maori Council's perspective when it comes to water. We've seen those arguments now taken to the Supreme Court and made in the Supreme Court. You know, I stand by the views that I've always held.
Do you have a feeling this is going to be a particularly divisive one candidate?
It's hard to know. I mean, look, in 2009 when I went there when I was first Prime Minister, I really expected it to be quite a celebratory type occasion, and that proved not to be the case. When you had Popata Brothers costing me in 2011, we always thought we'd get a bit of a chance to say a few words, and that just, from 2012 I think it was, and that just proved not to be the case with the protesters drowning us out. So, look, I don't know. I think the local kaumātua are doing their best to try and make sure that there's an opportunity for us to engage and say a few words. I hope that's the case. I mean, in the end, you know, Waitangi Day should be a day of celebration, and the marae is a place for both sides, you know, and Māori, to be able to put arguments and have debates. So hopefully that'll be the case, but in the end, that is a matter for local elders. If we can't say anything, well, they'll say anything.
You've made the Māori Party not to legislate against a court decision. If the Supreme Court comes out and says the sale is unlawful, what is your plan B? Well,
I'm just not going to comment on what the Supreme Court might or might not say. I mean, it would be bad form for me as Prime Minister to comment while they're adjudicating. We'll come back when they ultimately
do. You do have a plan B?
Well, I'm just not going to comment on what might happen next. Let's wait and see the
Why
judgment.
do you give Tita Whaihara and other members of your firm about Hannah Whare the mana or the opportunity to walk you on when some of your behaviour hasn't been that fantastic in the past?
Well, I guess in the way is, the way I would see it is I don't, in so much that, what happens on the marae is a matter for the elders, the Kamatua there at the lower marae, and I don't stipulate who can and can't, go onto the marae there, I don't anywhere around the country. So in the end, I'm a guest at their place, and I respect that. It's for them actually as the local elders to sort out the protocol of who's going to be taken onto the marae and who's not, and so in the end it's for them to resolve those issues.
Given your
So
history,
they
would you
have,
prefer if it was someone other than
Sorry?
Tita? Given your history, would you prefer if it was someone other than Tita?
I don't care, it'll be what it'll be.
Right, so they have actually chosen a person, so will you be going with that choice or choosing?
Well, look, we'll try and resolve it as best we can when we're there, but as I said, in the end, we leave it to the Kamatua and for them to inform us who they, who and how that will happen. I mean, if there are internal divisions, as there may or may not be, that's a matter for them hopefully to resolve themselves. All I can tell you is I'll be turning up in the morning, weather permitting, and going on the marae.
What has your office been advised at this point?
I don't think we've been formally advised, but mind you, historically I don't think we've been advised either. But my experience of being there in the past is you can be pretty sure the fire will be somewhere near me and near the front pretty quickly, and I imagine that will be a repeat tomorrow.
What about a woman on each arm? Would you
Thorn amongst roses.
Have you ever felt that Titify was bullying you running into the role?
Look, no, my time with her has been pretty limited in terms of going on the marae. There hasn't ever been a conflict about that role. Obviously there's been some public comment in recent times. I've seen those comments from Kingley and others. But in the end, it's a domestic matter, but I've come to learn not to try and involve myself and engage in the Maori politics.
At Supreme Court on Friday, the Crown lawyers said that the government's already in negotiations with Maori over every aspect of water ownership that the Maori Council were asking for. He said, when one asks what one means by ownership, there's nothing left. Is that your position, that you're negotiating on every aspect of water ownership with Maori?
Well, I'm not going to go into all of the comments that were made in the Supreme Court because I, A, was not there, and B, do not have all the judgment. What the government's position has always been is that we recognise there are rights and interests, and where we believe those rights and interests exist, we have been looking to address those. That remains the government's position. The government's position also is, as it's long-standing and remains, is that we don't believe anyone owns water.
Prime Minister, exporters of milk formula to China say that the DCD scare has pretty much stopped trade, and they're quite critical of the government's response, that there wasn't enough preparation and that it was, when it did happen, too slow. Do you have any concerns about what's happening in China around the DCD scare?
Well, first, I haven't had advice that it's stopping trade, and this is certainly not being reflected. Last time I looked in either Fonterra's share price or the New Zealand exchange rate. Secondly, no. I mean, I think in terms of the advice that the government's had, and we have a timeline of when we were advised. As soon as we were advised, we started working on that. In the end, you've got a situation where the government has accepted the view, because we believe it to be correct, that there are no health issues from the traces of DCD that have been detected in milk products. We remain of that view, and so there would be and always are risks when there is any kind of notification, because people can extrapolate that information. I think we saw that where it was described as a toxic substance. Well, technically yes it is, but not in the quantities that were marked there. So I'm not sure what else you really can do when those things turn up other than what Fonterra ultimately did do.
Was there a cover-up?
Well, not in my view. I'm seeing evidence of that, and again, I'm seeing any evidence of a change in either the share price or the exchange rate as a result of the information coming in the public domain.
The Chinese government's banned any imports of New Zealand milk powder that include any traces of DCD. Some exporters are saying the government should have got involved in government-to-government talks so that this ban was not put in place.
Well, you need to direct exactly those comments to the Trade Minister ultimately and to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but my understanding is that, from the best of memory I have, is that Tim Gross's office was working with officials, government officials in China. So I think there have been discussions, and we have been making sure that they understood and had the best advice that MPI had available to it.
Why did the Cabinet agree to put the Bain compensation application, delay it at the moment?
Primarily because David Bain requested it through his legal counsel. I mean, in the end, it's his application for compensation, and if he decides to want us to slow that process down, which is effectively what he's doing, then there's no particular reason why we wouldn't agree to that. I mean, in the end, as we say, it's his application. In the end, whether he's granted compensation or not is a matter solely for the Cabinet. And so, in the end, if he decides he wishes to slow the process down with a potential judicial review, then so be it.
So it was related directly to the judicial review?
Well, essentially it's slowed down while that process is now going through, but we're happy with it.
Would the Cabinet have any legal advice about the impact of the judicial review and any other further action that the government would take by seeking a further review or anything else?
Well, I'm not going to go through all of the discussions that the Cabinet had, except to say that the Minister gave us a briefing on what had taken place, and she is and remains very comfortable with the action she's taken. I mean, rightfully so. She makes the point that she needs to be able to go to Cabinet and make recommendations based on advice that she feels that she can rely on. And her fundamental position has been that the advice that she received through Justice Binney's report was not one that she could rely on, was out of scope with the letter written by the previous Minister of Justice, Simon Power, setting out the conditions that he wanted the review to be undertaken.
But could it have been a further waste of taxpayer time and taxpayer money and Crown time if the judicial review did find in David Bain's favour in terms of any other work that...
I think you're many steps ahead of yourself. So in the end, there'll be a judicial review. I mean, that's, the application will be before the court. They'll have a look at that matter. They'll need to consider all of the factors that are there, and we'll see what happens next.
Just in terms of your meeting with Julia Gillard, the Dominion Post today reported papers that Australian officials have been considering around the New Zealand residency issue, and perhaps sort of looking at an automatic residency after so many years.
Yep.
Is your understanding that that's going to be progressed by the Australian government?
No, I don't think I would be in a position to be able to say that will definitely be progressed. I mean, I think as I commented in Australia last year from memory, I know that Australia has and is given some consideration to the wider issue, and I've raised that with the Australian Prime Minister before. But I mean, in the end, there are a number of factors they need to consider. One of them is obviously the financial implications, but then there is, whether they think that there's fairness in the system as it currently sits. I mean, they have overridden their own rules from time to time, as we saw in the past with Queensland floods, for instance. So, I mean, the only things I can say is, look, in the end, I've no doubt the topic will be raised when Prime Minister's over on the weekend. But ultimately, what happens is a matter for the Australian government. We wouldn't take our writing instructions from the Australian government of how Australians should be treated in New Zealand any more than we are going to dictate terms to the Australian Prime Minister of how New Zealanders should be treated in Australia. I say to New Zealanders that think about crossing the Tasman, make sure you understand and you go there with your eyes open about what your rights and opportunities are, because they're very real, that you may not get the rights that you think you're going to enjoy. That's a matter for them to consider.
Well, do you think there is any will amongst Australian politicians to resolve this issue?
Well, I mean, I think my sense is yes, I mean, they are aware of the issue, and I think they are aware of some of the long-term implications of that, but that there's also fairly significant financial implications as well, and they'll obviously want to think that through. So I can't tell you if they'll move, and if they do move, when they'll move, and what it would look like, but certainly there's been discussions over the last few years which indicate that they're awake to the idea.
And you certainly wouldn't expect any announcements this weekend or this year?
I don't think we'll get announcements. I think you'd be free to ask those questions if you're coming to Queenstown.
Was DPMC involved at all in overpay?
DPMC?
Yeah, I see Martin Weavers is going to head the ministerial inquiry.
Well, he's going to head the ministerial inquiry, and no, I don't think they were involved. I mean, other than sort of, there was a cabinet paper at some point that would have gone to cabinet noting the issue or whatever, but outside that, no, they were actively involved. It was run by the Ministry of Education.
Were ministers told about the
question. I mean, in the end, that's what the ministerial review is all about. Ultimately, trying to work out who knew what, when, and how. From what I can see, and I haven't tried to again forensically ask the ministers these sorts of questions. What's been identified is yes, there were some flags, about 147 of them in total. None of them were deemed to be a showstopper. Most large systems like that will probably have some bugs in them when they go live. It's a very large, complicated system. And obviously the fact that they decided after a number of times where there were false starts to actually go live on the system gives you an indication that they felt they were ready to go. I think ministers genuinely are entitled to rely on expert advice, and there were two streams of that expert advice, the No Pay Board and the four independent advisors that gave advice to the ministers overall. So, I mean, my sense is that they felt they could rely and should rely on that information, but the absolute minutiae, we'll have to see with the ministerial inquiry.
Have you seen any advice or any opinions over the last year or two that there may be some question about whether Talent 2 has got the financial strength to go through it?
I haven't seen any on that. I mean,
it was being asked at the end of 2011 because the share price halved at one point.
Yeah, I mean, they've been around for a while and there are a mass national number of companies that can do, but I mean, my understanding of it in broad terms was that they run this kind of system in other parts of the world, or in Australia, and they certainly run it in New Zealand with New Zealand Post. This is a much more complicated system, and in hindsight you've probably got to say it looks like it was more complicated than they thought, and that's had some implications. They obviously run the call centres, and my understanding is they haven't put a lot more resources into trying to maintain those. But from the government's point of view now, we just need to try and pick up the pieces and see if we can fix it as fast as best we can.
Over the weekend, the trade weight index rose above 76,
yep.
And the New Zealand dollar strengthened over 81 Australian cents. Are you concerned about the strength of the currency?
Well, I've said before on numerous occasions we think it's a bit overvalued, particularly against the US. At 81 cents against the Australian, it's not particularly out of the normalised trading band. It's still probably at the lower end, and we've seen it up at nearly parity on a couple of occasions. So of itself, it's a reasonable move in recent times, but it's not a significant move in historical terms. Obviously the exchange rate is putting pressure on certain parts of the economy, but as Stephen Joyce himself pointed out on Friday, we have $1 in New Zealand. We don't have $1 for exporters and $1 for manufacturers and $1 for consumers. Unfortunately, we live within $1, and I still think that exchange rate is reflecting two things. I mean, fundamentally, long-term confidence actually in the New Zealand economy and New Zealand as a country, and the inherent weaknesses in particularly the United States, and even to a certain degree some weakening we've seen on the east coast of Australia.
So what do you make of Donny Alder's sudden resignation today?
Well, I'm not terribly surprised. I mean, you've had a change of chairman there, and the company's publicly indicated that it's experiencing some issues. I mean, in the end, that's a matter for the board and for him and for them to resolve that issue.
Prime Minister, what's your thoughts on New Zealand going to 3-day-a-week mail deliveries?
Well, there's a consultation process we need to go through. I mean, I think people can genuinely understand that the world is changing, and while some people are still very reliant on mail, for a lot of people that's a fraction of the way they receive information from the past. I mean, people do have electronic banking, they do receive emails or text messages a lot more than they would, say, for instance, historical mail. So, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that's where it goes, but they're going through a consultation process.
Would you support 3-day-a-week?
Well, I can understand the arguments. I mean, let's put it at that point, and we'll see what else comes out of that. I mean, maybe some other solution that comes up, but I can understand the implications of literally tens of millions of less mail being sent every year, and what that might mean for New Zealand Post.
Won't this hit the rural deliveries? Won't this hit rural deliveries a lot harder than deliveries in town, given that people are also delivering groceries and that sort of thing with those deliveries?
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue, and so that's why a consultation period is really important, to try and flesh out those issues and see whether there's some sort of way through addressing the hardest hit areas, vis-a-vis maybe the towns where it's much less an issue.
Just on
Is it Australia
just on
and New Zealand?
DCD.
Yeah, is there any room for some kind of review or look at how it was managed in terms of dealing with our trading partners, considering there was some reaction to the announcement?
Well, there'll always be a reaction to the announcement in so much that you're dealing with a sensitive area. I mean, despite the fact that we can say that it's not a health issue, it's not a health issue. The way these things get reported has implication in particularly Asian markets, which can be very sensitive to these issues. Will there be a review? Well, in the end, I'm sure Fonterra is doing its own internal review and reflection on this issue and trying to manage it as best they can. But I mean, once they detected those traces of DCD in milk, then that would always pose a communications problem with the best will in the world, and they've been working their way through that.
Do you think the time was acceptable? It was a long time.
Well, I can't, I don't know because I haven't asked the company about. I'm advised that they were sort of aware, I think in September, and I can't. I think the first time they came to the government was the end of October. From what I can see, the first time I was made aware of the issue was about the 18th of January, from the best I can see. So I mean, essentially, during I think it would have been November, certainly December, there was quite a bit of communication with the MPI and the company.
How bad would it have looked if Fonterra come out and said it was a health issue and we haven't told about you, we haven't told you to?
Well, I think you're asking a hypothetical question, which is a very different issue. I mean, to have a trace turning up where there are no health concerns and where you need to consume a swimming pool full of the stuff to have any health effects is vastly different from a hypothetical question you're asking about genuine health issues. I'm sure the company would respond to genuine health issues in a very different way. For start off, it would actually have to pull that product from the marketplace. Now, that wasn't the case when they found these very minute traces.
Do you think they took an acceptable calculated risk in waiting?
Sorry?
Do you think they took an acceptable calculated risk in waiting?
Well, you need to raise those questions with the company. It's not
Well, MPI waited too. They waited 6 weeks.
Well, again, you have to go back. You have to go back to the company really and ask about their own actions. I mean, I think in terms of MPI, they worked their way through the processes they saw it, but it wasn't a health issue, so I don't think they saw it as a major issue. But it's always sensitive in dealing with these things in foreign markets.
For New Zealanders going to Australia, what specific improvements would you like to see in terms of entitlements, maybe welfare, and as we saw at Sydney or Queensland floods? Are there any areas that New Zealand would like to see Australia move on?
Well, obviously, we always encourage a situation where New Zealanders are treated well and fairly, but that can have different definitions in different places. And so I might have a view on how I think Australia should deal with a New Zealander that's living here on a long-term basis, but it's not for me to tell the Australian government how to do that. It's certainly for me to make sure, as best I can, that New Zealanders are aware that while they have freedom of movement across the Tasman, that it's not freedom of the right to become a permanent resident and ultimately a citizen of Australia. And for a very long period of time now, that temporary sort of class of permanent residency has essentially brought with it very different rights and entitlements. So look, in the end, Australia will need to think through those issues. I mean, that's, if you think about it, if it means that a New Zealander that's lived in Australia for a long period of time has a child that, for instance, no longer has or doesn't have access to, for instance, a student loan, well, that may mean that the child may not go to a tertiary institution. And in New Zealand, we want to encourage people to get tertiary qualified because we know that leads to better financial outcomes both for them and the country. So in the end, countries need to think through their own policies, but it's not for us to dictate that.
Do you think, given the closeness and synergies with them, is there an imbalance between the rights enjoyed by Australians here and vice versa?
Well, there's clearly a difference. I mean, the reality is in New Zealand we accept Australians and on terms which see them enjoy essentially permanent residency and citizenship under almost uniform conditions, and it's different from the way they're treated in Australia. Maybe the level of migration is different, and it's something Australia's got to think through. They have their own rationale for bringing it in. It's not a new issue. In fairness to Julie Gillard, it's actually not a policy that was started by the Labor government, but it's certainly one that they need to consider whether they want to make some changes. But that's for you guys to raise with her.
We're still not likely to change our position on Australians.
We're not going to change our position on Australians. I mean, at the end of the day, we take the view that someone from Australia wants to come and live in New Zealand, provided they meet all of the sort of criteria around character, for instance, then hopefully they'll make a good addition to this country and